Hi, you cool cats and cool kittens. You can see how I've been spending my time over break, or not, I guess break. I don't know what you call this, but yeah. If you guys have any comments about the Tiger King, you can totally leave those in the discussion forum too. Like, did Carol Baskin kill her husband? I feel like he did. She did. But I want to hear any of those comments too, because I miss that. I miss like sitting with you guys and talking pop culture. So we'll talk E Cummings, but if you want to fill me in on any good shows you've been watching or let me know what you thought of the Tiger King, let me know about that too. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few poets today. The first one on this video is going to be E Cummings. The poets that we're covering today are all in that modernist group, which would I talked about Dickinson and Whitman the other day. I told you, that was sort of the beginning of the American modern movement in poetry and other arts as well. Um, so when we use the word modern with a capital M, we're not talking about modern like the way you think about it, like something that's happening recently. Like that type of poetry we would call contemporary poetry. But when I say modern, it's like romantic poetry from the like in the numbers here, the 18th century, the 19th century, with the Victorians, and then we had the beginning of the modernist movement. So at the beginning of the 20th century is really when the modernist movement took hold. And E Cummings, who we're doing today, Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Hilda Doolittle, Marianne Moore, tons of other ones. All these poets really were very, like, it was an intention to create something new, to write in an authentic American voice, to write poetry that was new, that was simple, that spoke the way people speak, or in the language of music instead of the language of a metronome. There was a sort of an offshoot or a sect of modernism called Imagism, where everything was about the image, and poetry was stripped down, but sometimes more complicated in some ways. Like Ezra Pound, we're going to look at one poem by Ezra Pound, which is actually a really beautiful and simple poem. But sometimes I think he made modernism more complicated than it needed to be. But it was important to note that there were voices from all over the country, and a lot of these people were actually living in Europe as expatriates. But their goal was to create something new, a voice that was uniquely American and modern, and a type of poetry that had never been seen before. Most of it was free verse, not rhyming. Um, they're some of my favorite poets. Like this is one of my old books, and I love the modernists. I love talking about them. So E. Cummings, who we did In Just and that L.A. poem La, we'll call it. His poems also were untitled, like Emily Dickinson, so we just refer to them by their first line. Cummings was born in Massachusetts to a pretty intellectual, well-to-do family. His father was a professor at Harvard, and Cummings went to Harvard. And then when he was a young man, he volunteered to drive an ambulance in World War One in France, which, if you know anything about Hemingway, he also drove an ambulance in World War One in Europe. So obviously, that's a tough job. You're picking up wounded and dying and sometimes dead soldiers from the battlefield, and you see a lot of grisly scenes of these young men that were not much younger, much older than him, and so that shaped him. Then also, when he was in France, he and a friend were accused falsely of espionage, and they spent a few months in a prison in France, which was traumatic. But he actually kind of made light of it. He wrote kind of an amusing story about it. But obviously, those experiences, shaped his life as a young man. After the war, when he came back to the United States, he continued to travel. He was a painter as well as a writer. I'm also going to post the links. You can click on those to hear him read his own poetry. He was also one who gave a very stirring rendition of his poetry. He had a very deep, booming voice, and he was known a lot for some of his more experimental pieces, like the La poem we're going to look at. You can see in his poetry that, like Dickinson, he also used capitalization strangely. He capitalized words that didn't necessarily need to be capitalized, or he didn't capitalize words that we typically would capitalize. His spacing is strange. Sometimes there's long spaces or lines between words, and sometimes words are run together. He uses dashes. He uses shapes of poems. He uses punctuation really erratically and uniquely. And we'll take a look at, how and why. And I told you, I think, in the very first video I made about how to read a poem, that poets in this generation were some of the first poets to have typewriters at home. And so they weren't just writing longhand. When they were composing their poetry, they actually could see how it would look when it was typeset and published in a book. And a typeset letter looks different than a printed or cursive letter. So that, just the act of writing with a typewriter instead of writing with a pen sort of changed poetry. Like today we write on our phones and we use emojis and things like that, and how is that going to shape the next movement of literature? It's strange, the things that do affect our literature. So let's take a look at we'll take a look at law. We'll call it law. If I asked you to just read that poem, how you would read that poem. You could read it left to right, top to bottom. La, le, af, fa, l, swan, il, inus. I told you, when you first look at it, it doesn't even look like, not just doesn't look like a poem, it doesn't look like anything coherent. It just looks like, you dropped your phone, or you the cat walked across the keyboard is the example I usually give. And this is the brilliance of this poem. The brilliance of it is that you look at it and you're like, what is this? What is this weird tumbling of letters down a page? And then you try to read it and you literally don't know how to read it. You don't know how to pronounce things. You don't know how to make sense of them. But when you let it unfold for you, it is so meaningful and so powerful and so like it creates so many feelings for you. And you're just like, how? Like, not even words, just a couple of the strokes of a keyboard, and he's able to create that. So I wrote it out like this, just so we could kind of look at it, because it's a very visual piece. You need to actually see how it's written on the page. So maybe if you played with it a little bit, you would see that there's inside the parentheses and outside of the parentheses. So outside of the parentheses, you see the word loneliness, right? There's an L and then own, l-iness. And then inside the parentheses, it says a leaf falls. So that's, if you want to try to find words in it, there you go. A leaf falls, loneliness, or loneliness, a leaf falls. If you just look at the poem on the page, it's obviously written strangely, right? It's written sort of vertically instead of horizontal lines. What does it look like? You could say it looks like a tree. A leaf falls off a tree. You could say it looks like that leaf that's actually falling sort of, vertically down into maybe the pile of leaves at the bottom on the ground. What does it look like? It also kind of looks like a number one. And the idea of loneliness, or, a leaf, a singular leaf, that's one thing. So that's like sort of the next layer of it. You just see just the shape of the poem itself. And then if you try to make sense of the lines as they go, the first line is L-A. And in Spanish, la is a singular article. It's one thing, right? It's not las, it's la. So that's singular. And then the second line is le, which is French for, again, a singular article, one thing. The other thing to note about this is that, and you can't quite appreciate it with my handwriting here, is that when you type the letter L, the letter lowercase letter L on a typewriter, it's the same stroke as the number one, and it's almost the same stroke as a capital I. So this poem consists almost entirely of these letters that look like either a one or an I, even though a lot of them are lowercase l's. So we have, the two L's from fall here, but it's almost like the number one, singular. And then the way the word loneliness is broken up, we actually have the word one on a line. And then another one of these letter strokes, that could be a one or could be an I, which again is a singular being. And then the end of loneliness is broken on this last line into I-ness, like me-ness, like the sense of just being with myself, right? So in this poem, there is one image and one abstraction. One image is a leaf falls. And just in your comments, tell me all the associations, all the feelings, what does that create in you when you imagine a leaf falls? First of all, a leaf falls really slowly. It doesn't just plunk out of a tree like an acorn. When the leaf is attached to the tree, it's a part of all the other leaves, it's a part of the tree. When it lands on the ground, it's a part of all the other leaves that are going to be on the ground around it. But in the act of falling, it is singular and alone. I think we said at the end of We Real Cool that the we is this group and they're together, but in the very last line it just says die soon. It's the only line in the poem that doesn't have the word we in it, because in that moment you are alone. So it's kind of, a little bit of an echo of that. But that image of the leaf falling, I want you to just kind of close your eyes and imagine it. Imagine, it makes you think of autumn. What does autumn make you think of? What's happening in that moment when the leaf falls? What's different between a tree with full leaves and a bare tree? And then what comes in between is each leaf singularly falling. Do you feel melancholy? Do you feel sad? Do you feel hopeful? It's part of nature and it's a part of cycle, and it's going to become part of the earth again. And then it's going to fertilize the tree and new leaves are going to bloom in the spring. But I want you to pay attention to that image and just let it, because again, it's the only image in the poem, let it wash over you. And then the abstraction is the word loneliness. And how does that relate to the image? Is that leaf lonely? And how do you think the poet felt about loneliness? There's a difference between being lonely and being alone, I think. Maybe it's just semantic, but what do you feel? When I say loneliness, is that the same to you, or does that strike a different chord for you than being alone? So I'm going to leave a lot of this open to you, to how you feel about it, and I really do want to hear what you think about it, but I needed to make a little bit of sense of it for you. I think you need to first pay attention to the shape of the entire poem. Then you can look at the strokes of the poem and how over and over again the repetition of the one or the I, even though sometimes they're lowercase L's, how that just keeps bringing you to yourself. It's just you. It's just that leaf. It's singular, one, loneliness, and that really quiet image of a leaf falling. So after you hear all this and are able to sort of put all this together, I want you to comment on the discussion forum and let me know how you feel and what it evokes for you. Like I said, it looks like nothing much, but once you start to really, like I said, just kind of play with all the layers of this poem, you're just like, how did he do that? How did he keep repeating the singularity in this poem, the individual, the loneliness, the quietness, the I, the one, the singular, the tree, the leaf, and just have it just become, I don't know, all these layers of meaning and feeling. You could write pages and pages and about how you feel and how the leaves are falling and I feel alone, but these little strokes on the page create all of that emotion in the reader and more. It's really amazing. Okay, the other poem by E Cummings that we're going to look at is Unjust. And I'm not going to read that because I'm going to also post a link to Cummings reading that poem for you. So again, it's not quite as experimental looking on the page as the other poem, but you can see there's big spaces. The first word of the poem is not capitalized, but then the word just is. And then there's a dash after just. And then there's the word spring, and then there's like 5 spaces after the word spring. Words are hyphenated. Whistles, far and we is spaced out. But then the names of the children, Eddie and Bill and Betty and Isabel, they are all run together into one word. So definitely playing again with language, and not just for the sake of like, oh, this is cool, let's run words together, or let's, put extra spaces, but to shape the way you read the poem, to manipulate the way you understand the poem. And so I believe in your text there's a footnote that says that balloon man is related to Pan. And Pan was one of those, was he a satyr or a centaur? One of those little half goat, half people. I really should, again, do a little research before I start talking on video. He was a satyr. My son's in the other room. He told me he's a satyr. Are they the half goat people?
Yeah.
Okay. Half goat guy. Like the bottom half of him was goat, top half was man. And he's kind of lecherous. He was kind of like a dirty old man satyr. Like, first of all, like when he would be drawn in classical art, he had like these grotesque and exaggerated genitals, and it's just, big goat balls, really. Not the most attractive guy in the world. And he was just always chasing the nymphs around. He was just this horny old satyr. I really should teach classic literature. I'm really good at this. But one time he was chasing this little nymph named Echo, and poor little Echo did not want any part of him. So she turned herself into a reed, like almost like a cattail, and so she could hide from him. And he came and he cut them all down, not knowing which one was her. And then he made a pan flute. So if it's got like 4 or 5 little pipes kind of together, and they're like cracking myself up tonight. Played this little pan flute, and one of the reeds that he made the pan flute at was actually little Echo. So he's kind of related to sexuality in a strange way. So just like a little reference to tuck away in your head. But it starts out with "in just spring." And so what are the associations you make with spring? Spring is rebirth, spring is new life, spring is baby animals, spring is literally the birds and the bees coming back. And you know that the birds and the bees is a euphemism for when you were young and your parents had the sex talk with you, the birds and the bees. So it's kind of this season of lushness, of awakening. And so it's also, God, like some of the imagery in this poem, just mud luscious and puddle wonderful. Like, love those freaking words. Love those words. And March and April are just totally mud luscious and puddle wonderful, moist and just earthy and grassy and ripe. And so the scene he's kind of creating is a bunch of kids in a big park playing. And it's spring, and you can imagine again when you've been in the house all winter and the kids finally get to go outside and play, and it's fresh air and it feels so lovely. But then there's this little balloon man in the park whistling far and wee, like calling to the children. And what are the children doing? Well, Eddie and Bill, with their names run together, so it's like the boys. You can see that the boys are in the boy group and the girls are Betty and Isabel, and they're in the girl group. And the boys are playing marbles and pirates. Again, sort of, when kids are little, they do kind of play in gender specific groups. The boys, if like, I don't know at your school, but my school, when we went out for recess, like the boys would all run in one direction and the girls would all run in another direction. And so you can kind of imagine that these Eddie and Bill being just sort of representative of all little boys and the little boy games they play. And then the girls are in their group playing hopscotch and things like that, sort of playing the little girl games and not even really aware of each other. The girls are in their group doing their thing, the boys are in their group doing their other thing, but it's spring and there's this awakening. And that old creepy balloon man keeps blowing his whistle. And when the boys hear it, they come running from their games. And then the girls hear it and they come running from their games until they're all together. And then it says, and it's spring, and the goat-footed balloon man whistles far and wee. And so it's kind of, like a sexual awakening for the children. They're not children anymore. They're on the brink of puberty, of leaving behind, playing, the boys all playing together and the girls all playing together. They're becoming aware of each other. They're becoming aware of themselves. They're becoming aware of the birds and the bees and the balloon man. And that's what spring is sort of, about in a lot of ways. Like I said, animals, that's when, they mate and have babies. It's a change. It's a change of seasons, and it's a change in the children's life. So it's all of that. It's a celebration of spring. It's a celebration of growing up. It's a celebration of awareness and coming into adulthood. And it's also just told in this incredibly unique way with words that are falling down the page and sounds that are like, we being stretched out and, um, just again, the playfulness of the language, images and words like mud luscious and puddle wonderful, the repetition of certain things like the goat footed balloon man, the old queer balloon man. um, what do you think? What were your thoughts on this film? Were you able to make sense of it at all? Were you able to appreciate the playfulness of the language and, just again, the spacing and the placement of the words on the page? Want to hear your thoughts on these two pieces by E Cummings.